And good evening. It's August 27th, 2024, and we're in the following collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series, right? It's a series from the Bible Project about the entire TaNaK, that Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the TaNaK, the Old Testament source video section set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class, if you listen to that in-class lecture first, they, of course, would all be found in that source video playlist. Because we're going to try to keep these to about 15 minutes. We'll make them easy to catch and easier to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and maybe different twist on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, it's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. Because in this series, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, the entire Old Testament, and yet we're going to do it in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So, could get interesting as we get past the first 5. But remember, the videos that we're going to discuss here, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're part of our learning series that I highly recommend, and they can all be found on the Bible Project website, and of course in our source video playlist. As we're in this series, I want us to remember that there will probably be a lot more questions than we have answers for. We're going to try to respond to some of the information. As we discuss it, I'm just going to leave it up to you if it's an answer. So Exodus, Shemot, 19 through 40, and this is our part 2. So to clarify, I'm not a replacement theology believer. I don't believe the church replaced Israel in any way, shape, or form. Being part of the church involves similarities, which is what would I do if I were in that family, since I am? So for part of that kingdom of priests, I'm all for it. So what do priests do? What do? I see nowhere in Scripture that job has gone away. Because it's a fair question. It's an interesting one. What does a priest do? We believe, at times I think, that priests are a glorious position. It's a role to aspire to. It's elevated above the rest. But when we look at the Scriptures, we look at these stories, we look at the priests, I don't believe we see that. We look at Torah. It'll be a challenge if one thinks that it's no longer relevant, because the priests of God and His Son called us to be, those servants, those roles, they're actually laid out in there. Because priests, they have varied roles. Not all are at the temple handling sacrifices. Their work is a service job. It's a community job that relies on the community for their health and their survival. Because if we say we want to be priests, then looking at the job description might be then a good idea. Then we'll eventually get to see some examples in the choices. But that's a bit later on in these scrolls. But let's remember these nations, these other kingdoms, the ones that God also wants to bless, because we as priests, we're going to serve them. Priests, it's not a ruling job. They never have been. It's in the story. Because it's a story that Jesus echoes in His Sermon on the Mount, uses His life as an example for us. We just don't want to live that way sometimes. I belong to a men's group. We use a messaging platform to connect, since some of us are geographically challenged and cannot meet in person. So I received a message with a link to a YouTube clip about speaking a blessing over yourself. And it caused me to pause and think. Does a priest bless themselves or bless others? And is that the thought we should have, speaking blessings over ourselves, or should we be doing it over others? Because in this story, we're going to see about the over others rather than ourselves. This section in Scripture might have a few things to say about that. And then maybe we might have a need of a change of attitude, or focus might be in order. You know, it's an interesting difference to focus not on ourselves, but on others. To pray for someone else rather than ourselves. Now, even in the famous Lord's Prayer, if we look at that need, they talked about it and viewed it as praying for the rest of the community. That might just alter our focus. Just like a priestly thought, if others are focused on others, then maybe there's a good chance that more people will actually end up praying for me than just me. Because I'm just praying for myself, asking for blessings instead of casting the net wider, engaging in more priestly behavior. Like Tim said, there are laws. In this scroll alone, we see the big 10, and then there's 52 more to follow, all focused on worship and social justice. Interestingly enough, those are both things about community and relationships and between God and man. It sounds like the foundation of the two that Jesus responds with, love God with everything that you are, and love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That seems very other-focused on priestly, right, that Jesus said, which was something that he said wouldn't go away. Because again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Why would this all have gone away? Worship, social justice, way to live together. Why would all the death of the Messiah make that go away? Say none of that matters now. It's more important than ever. The opposite of not, like the Messiah said, none of this goes away, not a jot or a tittle, until everything's been completed. Interesting thought to ponder. So I love the point where they get to the restoration of God's presence. I like this as a point where God says, hey, I want to come down and dwell with you. I want to hang out with you guys. Interestingly, when he does that, he takes Moses to look at something else in another realm. So let me see if I can articulate this the way I want to. So we have a place in the heavenly realm that God has there, and he wants that there. But his presence is already there. So why is the tabernacle there? More questions, right? Why is the tabernacle there if the presence of God is there? So what's the purpose of the tabernacle there? I have these weird side thoughts when I look at some of these, and I think that, okay, still we want to have God's will on earth as it is in heaven. We have interactions like this where we get a glimpse into heaven and we see this place, right? Moses takes that, brings it down. Build it down here with God's presence in mind. I like that. But boy, does that bring up some questions, right? There are lots of questions that I have no answers to. Questions still remain. Because I enjoy the tabernacle, where God will choose to dwell amongst his people. I love the garden imagery throughout this whole thing. I mean, it's woven into the tent. It's in this meeting place that God will enter into. He's going to place himself. And we even get to the implements inside, and we'll eventually get to that ark itself, right? Again, one of the things that I find interesting about Scripture is its combination of being vague and yet also being very detailed. Because there's lots of it both ways. Okay, I should say lots. There's more vagueness than there is detail. So I think when we get to details, they're meant to be focused on, to pay attention to, maybe to see what God expected. It also interests me because this tabernacle, it was built, right? It was maintained, and yet, it was never built again. Once the temple had taken its place, we never see this again. But there were some families assigned to move the individual parts to the tabernacle from place to place when they move this thing around. You know, when I think of that, I chuckle a bit because I think of the Amish doing a barn raising, right? All those people all moving a barn. Because everybody has a place and a function, and they do it together as a whole. I think of that when I think of the tabernacle, along with all the families, with the individual parts. Their job is to maintain and to protect. So they would pack it up, go to the next place, set it all back up again. It was their part, their priestly part, to bring it, to have it all to put back together again. But it seems that the detail is sometimes significant to God, even if it's not repeated. It's really interesting. And again, this raises more questions. Yet we need to remember that at the point in this book that the tabernacle hadn't been built yet, it's not even down to the people who are going to build and maintain it. We're not there yet. Moses is up there getting all this info, finding out about this beautiful thing to be built, looking at it, seeing it so he can go down and orchestrate it so that it can be repeated. Meanwhile, as Tim said, the Israelites have gotten impatient at the foot of this mountain. You know, we love to throw them under the bus because they get impatient after 40 days of waiting. You know, it's so hypocritical to complain about them waiting for 40 days, especially in our day and age. It's almost criminal. But we complain about standing in to get something for a line in mere minutes. We want what we want, the way we want it, and we want it quickly. But they are waiting at the foot of a mountain with all the storming going off above. 40 days pass. It does ask questions. I mean, simple things. What would you do if somebody from your life had been gone for 40 days? I mean, they don't know. Is Moses dead? It's an honest question. They don't even have an Amber Alert system to find people. After 40 days, I sympathize with them. I empathize with them. I get it. I'll be honest. I would wonder if something didn't work after 40 days. I think we need to remember what they have seen from God so far. What have they actually seen? I mean, they've witnessed much devastation. I mean, more devastation than they had rescue. In a sense. And this means that of the miraculous points, right? We have the parting of the sea to protect them, the daily bread, the water. But in contrast to that story, we have 10 plagues. And that parting of the sea event, well, that also caused more death. So there's not much intimacy there, not much connection. There's not. Because remember, they're living it out in their lifetime. This was real for them at the moment, because there's not. But God is up on the mountain with Moses trying to put together that plan, which includes the tabernacle, but they're not there yet. They're at the foot of the mountain. They're deciding if Moses has been struck down. They were warned not to go up on the hill. Seems they've respected that. Because I think they knew this was a God event. And they know what happens when God says what he says. And they wanted to recognize it in the way that they understood recognizing God's in their past. They want images that work for them. Something to reference, to look at, inspire, remember. This will probably raise a few eyebrows, maybe divide the room. But we love our crosses. We love our statues. We love our pictures in our churches. We love our crosses out front, our imagery. The fact that it points out that we love our imagery. This is what we do. It's what we as human beings like to do. I'm not sure why. Because again, there are more questions that I don't have answers for. But they go with imagery that works for them. And they chose the golden calf. So next week, we're going to discuss that choice and its consequences for the individuals and the community. Because just like them, we just want to see God the way we choose. So thanks for with us tonight on another edition of Outside the Class, the TaNaK, the Old Testament, on the Dusty Feet.